Okay, this lecture is going to be about G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc. They're two academic heroes. I just start off with this painting because it's kind of a beautiful painting and it's sort of a modern view of Christianity and the church. I like the Gothic cathedrals better. This is a little bit more of an English Protestant cathedral, but it's still beautiful. We'll go a little bit more into that later, but we're really going to be talking about Chesterton especially. He's got a lot of great quotes, and I really like a lot of the things he said and did. Okay, so, and also the point of this, I know a lot of people come to this YouTube channel because they especially want to hear about nutrition information, and I got lots of videos on nutrition information, but, I wrote a bunch of books about humanities topics, and in particular, I wrote a book about quotes. I collected all the best quotes from history. I've been doing this since I was like 20 years old, and I got many thousands of them, thousands of pages of them. And G.K. Chesterton was a bright guy, and he was a great man, and so there's a few things that are worthwhile learning from him. He's got a great song. He wrote the song, "O God of earth and altar, bow down and hear our cry. Our earthly rulers falter, our people drift and die." And it goes on and on. It's a great song. The best version, I think, is by Tim Bouchon. You can just go look this up on YouTube. Iron Maiden, they're like one of the best heavy metal bands of all time. They made a song about him. I think it's called Revelations. And there's other versions of it that are beautiful. It's sung in choir. It's beautiful. If you only get that song out of it, this will be worth your time. They both were sort of the dominant Catholic writers of the early 1900s. I just read some books summarizing all the history of Catholic converts and Catholic writers, and they stood out as, and Chesterton and Belloc go together. George Bernard Shaw used to call them Chester Belloc. Chesterton lived from 1874 to 1936, and you'll see he's got a lot of good quotes, and he does a good job with, a chiasmus type of rhetoric whereby the sentence turns backwards on itself. Kind of like JFK had said, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. He'll do a lot of that. And Oscar Wilde, of course, was the big, great comedic playwright with chiasmus type rhetoric back in the 1800s. And then with Chesterton, it sort of more went towards religious rhetoric, but a lot of philosophy and whatnot. And, learning all this stuff makes you smarter. Okay, so here's a typical Chesterton quote. "Where does a wise man hide a pebble? On the beach. Where does a wise man hide a leaf? In the forest." Okay, there's wisdom and stuff like that. Okay, Chesterton. "The madman is not the man who has lost his reason. The madman is the man who has lost everything except his reason." Yeah, when you get to these guys who think that science only and they're always right, they just want to get rid of everybody, okay? That's what guys like that are all about. Look at Robespierre, okay? We don't need religion. We don't need God. Just whatever they say. That's all you need. Okay, Chesterton continues. "The disadvantage of men not knowing the past is that they do not know the present. History is a hill or a high vantage point from which men can understand the age in which they live." Yeah, I think, for example, you got to read the history of Rome, ancient Rome. I mean, when you read the history of ancient Rome, so many things just become obvious to you. And I think that's why so many people in the modern world are so ignorant and helpless, because they haven't studied history. The way you understand current events is by comparing them to historical events. A tremendous amount of value comes from studying the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans, the Renaissance, and other time phases in history. Okay, here's another quote from Chesterton about evolution. "It is absurd for the evolutionist to claim that it is unthinkable for God to make everything out of nothing, and to pretend that it is more thinkable that nothing should turn itself into everything. Evolution as an explanation, as an ultimate philosophy on the cause of living things, is still faced with the problem of producing rabbits out of an empty hat." Chesterton. Okay, I've talked about it in other lectures, but the average young person thinks that Darwinism is like some type of science of creation and stuff. They don't know what they're talking about. Darwinism has nothing to do with creation, and it's really sort of the creation story of atheism. That's a whole other topic, but it's important to realize that because so many, people, they just volunteer to be dehumanized. If you're not created in the image of God with a biblical worldview and you're just a talking primate, you have dehumanized yourself, okay? And you think that's no big deal. That's a tremendously big deal. It means you have no rights. It means somebody owns you like somebody owns an animal. That's a big deal. And Again, I'm trying to just help people be educated so they have a historical, philosophical perspective. And, I like the idea of the individual freedom of people in a society being free to make their own decisions about what they want to do, how they want to live. And that's actually a rare thing in history. Most countries, nations, whatever you want to call them, they were big flat places where one ruler just conquered everybody and made them obey all their rules. Look at Egypt, for example. For thousands of years, there is no progress at all in art. And, an average guy just has to go and build a pyramid for the pharaoh. Okay, that's not that great of a life in my opinion. Okay, here's another quote from, a bunch more quotes from Chesterton. The way to love anything is to realize it may be lost. Without education, we are in danger of taking educated people seriously. Most of the so-called experts are phony BS artists, okay? When you actually really study what people are saying or doing. So you have to choose pretty careful what is real expertise, Let's see, I just reread, the China study by T. Colin Campbell, and that guy's a real expert, magnificent. He deserves a Nobel Prize for his work on protein. When he gets away from protein, he doesn't know as much, okay? But on protein, he's magnificent. Okay, let's see, continuing with Chesterton quotes. It isn't that they can't see the solution, it's that they can't see the problem. You will never find the solution if you don't see the problem. Oh, that is so common. Most people are so ignorant, they don't even know they're ignorant. Okay, now how could you not end up being a peasant or a slave if you don't even understand the basic issues, as most people don't? That's sad. That's why I think freedom in society is just going down the tubes, because most people don't even know what it is, because they don't have any historical perspective. They just basically believe whatever they were told last week, and there's that's reality. Well, that's only seeming reality for a simpleton, like Plato's cave. Okay, Chesterton, thinking means connecting things. Don't be so open-minded that your brains fall out. Tolerance is the virtue of people who do not believe in anything. These are the days when a Christian is expected to praise every creed except his own. Okay, so that's a good quote, and that reminds me of people don't understand, they see the big cathedral. Where Christianity comes from is, the poor people in Rome, all right? And there were slaves and peasants, and this is Nero, the emperor of Rome, and he would burn the Christians as torches. And that's sort of where Christianity comes from. Rulers want to get rid of religions. They want people to worship them. They want to be the god of the society, okay? So that's why you'll see, the idea of rulers, they don't want these religions uniting people. What does religion mean? It means re ligare, to ligate, to tie together, to tie the people together. So that's why religion wants a ruler wants all the people on their own. It doesn't even want them to have families. Edmund Burke had said the family is a platoon of freedom. Rulers want everybody to be, just separate. They're farm animals. Okay, come on. Once you go from atheistic Darwinism to the idea that humans are just talking primates, well, then they have an owner. Primates, chimpanzees and gorillas are in a zoo, okay? And most rulers, if you get them off of a microphone, they just feel like they own the people, and the people should do as they're told, and, like a farm animal that's owned. And that's pretty obvious all through history. Okay, some more quotes from Chesterton. Education is the period during which you are instructed by somebody you do not know about something you do not want to know. And that's pretty much what I think of most of the public schools. I mean, how much do you remember that was useful to you from high school other than learning how to type? Okay? And if you look at academic and intellectual progress, most of the genius spent a large amount of their life being homeschooled or being self-educated. You hardly ever see, genius type material coming straight out of a university that wasn't developed separately on that person's own or that. Okay, the purpose of compulsory education is to deprive the people of their common sense. It kind of makes everybody uniform and the same. I've had young people tell me that. They said, gee, they go to high school, and they said the more high school goes on, the more they notice that everybody kind of becomes the same. Okay, to many men, the theory of evolution was heartbreaking. This is from Chesterton again. It seemed that an ape had suddenly risen to gigantic stature and destroyed the seven heavens. But the position of those who regarded opening The Descent of Man by Charles Darwin as the opening of one of the 7 seals of the last days is a great deal sounder than people have generally allowed. They have fundamentally rebelled against Darwinism, not because they had a fear that it would affect Scripture, but because they had a fear, not altogether unreasonable or ill-founded, that it would affect morality. G.K. Chesterton. Okay, and that goes with Brothers Karamazov quote by Fyodor Dostoevsky that, said by Ivan, if there is no God, then everything is permitted, even cannibalism. Basically, there's no rules. Whatever the ruler says, that's the rules. Once you get rid of, a God-based worldview creates another way of looking at things in society, another viewpoint, something that one can appeal to. Without that, there is no appeal. Okay? Chesterton continues. The only reason people can criticize persons above them in the society is because there's a God and there's a concept of a religion. If men will not, and here's Chesterton continues, if men will not be governed by the 10 commandments, they shall be governed by the 10,000 commandments. 10,000. And now Chesterton continues, the more I considered Christianity, the more I found that while it established a rule and order, the chief aim of that order was to give room for good things to run wild. The problem of disbelieving in God is not that a man ends up believing nothing. It's much worse than that. He ends up believing anything. You could tell the average stupid person anything. Just say it, repeat it. They'll believe it. Anything. Literally anything. I know plenty of people, their opinions change 180 degrees opposite if they just get trained a little bit to believe the opposite. It's almost like a joke you could play on them. The Catholic Church is much too universal to be called international, for she is older than all the nations. She is not some sort of new bridge to be built between these separated islands. She is the very earth and ocean bed upon which they are built. It never occurs to the critic to do anything so simple as to compare what is Catholic with what is non-Catholic. The one thing that never seems to cross his mind when he argues about what the church is like is the simple question of what the world would be like without it. That's a good point. Yeah, the church has got plenty of problems, plenty of stupidities, and I'm raised Catholic, and I like the Catholic Church history and tradition and its art, its painting, its music, its sculpture, its cathedrals. All that is great. I think the current Pope stinks, okay? What's the current Pope going to do to me? He's not going to do anything. Stalin said this. How many divisions does the Pope have? Okay. But it's also true, I don't think that the Catholic Church can improve itself until it gets a new Pope and a new attitude, and I think it needs to allow priests to be married. But that's a whole other subject. But I still make the point is, despite all its problems, the Catholic Church done a lot of good for the world. It started the university system through the scholastics. It started the hospital system. And the Spanish Inquisition was terrible, but that was largely run by, the King and Queen of Spain and other countries, King of France, for example. You look at communism, Stalin killed 65 million people, Mao about 100 million people, okay? What did the Spanish Inquisition kill? Something like about 2,000 people in 400 years? Yeah, that's terrible, but it's nothing compared to Stalin or Mao, all right? And the average stupid person will choose a Stalin or a Mao. That's what's so sad. I hope we don't end up like that. Okay, Chesterton continues. How can we say that the church wishes to bring us back to the Dark Ages? The church was the only thing that brought us out of them. Okay, and that's one thing too. I mean, if you read the Bible, you don't have to read the Bible, but if you read the Bible, I think it's good to read it so you can understand literature and a lot of other things you get that are good from it. But one of the things you get is, you'll see, when a society turns its back on God, God turns his back on them. And you could go, ha, 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 that's just a joke. But you'll see what I'm saying is true if you actually study history. I'm not talking in a religious sense. I'm talking in a plain historical sense. The religion united the people, and it made them believe that their society, their culture was worth keeping or defending. Once they give up religion, they don't have any principles. There's no right or wrong. There's no tradition that they have, really. They disappear, okay? And that's old stuff. That's been known for thousands of years, but the average modern person doesn't know that. And that's why I think the average modern person doesn't have enough roots to keep anything persistent, okay? And so one of the things I like about this Catholic Church idea is that nobody cares what an individual does. I could care less what some individual does, but I do care about society, because what society chooses to believe and accept as morality and right or wrong affects everybody. And if they don't try to maintain some type of workable free structure, the freedoms get taken away. Another quote by Chesterton: "It is the test of a good religion whether you can joke about it." The beauty and the real blessing of the book, A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, does not lay in the mechanical plot of it, the repentance of Scrooge. It lays in the great happiness that glows from Scrooge and everyone around him. Whether the Christmas visions would or would not convert Scrooge, they convert us. Dickens quite obviously existed to champion everything that the Puritans had existed to destroy. Puritanism, by the way, meant to purify Christianity of Catholics. Religious liberty might be supposed to mean that everybody is free to discuss religion. In practice, it means that hardly anybody is allowed to mention it. G.K. Chesterton. Okay. Chesterton continues, "The old legends were right when they said that Arthur would come back." So yeah, there's the idea of the once and future King Arthur. Is he going to come back? Okay. But there's some great stories in the old King Arthur legends. All right. Chesterton continues, "All centralized systems mean the rule of the few. The fact is this, that the modern world with its modern movements is living on its Catholic capital. The characteristic formula for modern skepticism is that Homer was not written by Homer, but by another person of the same name. The church has been cruel, but the world has been much, much, much more cruel. The apostles might have hidden the body of Jesus to announce a sham miracle, but it is very difficult to imagine men being tortured and killed for the truth of a miracle which they knew to be a sham. I can tell you, if you read about the history of the early church, like the best book, I read a whole bunch of books about it. The best one is The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. It's real quick, concise, and entertaining. That's why I mention it. Most of the other ones are kind of long-winded and excessively detailed. But it's a typical thing that when somebody studies Christianity to make fun of it or to refute it, they end up converting to Christianity. You'll be amazed at how good the evidence is for early Christianity in the Bible. You'll be amazed. It's rather an amazing thing to study it. And that's another thing too. Would all of these apostles and disciples have died for Christ in the memory of him if they didn't truly believe it? I don't think so. And they're the ones that knew him. Okay, the only things that can satisfy the soul are a person and a story, and even the story must be about a person. Yeah, people like people. Let's see here. I really think that a man who has tamed a wife is more exceptional than a man who has tamed a tiger or a chimpanzee. The normal man is more afraid of his wife than his wife is afraid of him. Okay, this is silliness. All right, Chesterton continues. Humor always has it in some idea of the humorist himself as being at a disadvantage and caught in the entanglements and contradictions of life. All men in history who have really done anything have had their eyes fixed on the past. I think that's also true, that you have to have a sense of what's gone before you, either in your academic field or in other aspects of history, to want to improve upon it. If you're just an ignoramus who doesn't know anything about history or the past, then you really don't have a direction or something, a standard to improve above. All the men who have really been the bold artists, the realistic artists, the uncompromising artists, are the men who have turned out, after all, to be writing with a purpose. Yeah, and that's another thing true. I noticed, like, for example, I'm reading this nutritional oncology book, and on the surface of it looks real professional, and here's why I mention it. And it was funded by Michael Milken, the famous stock market guy. There's a whole bunch of different authors. As soon as you see more than 2 authors, that's a major red flag. The book probably sucks. I can tell you, almost all these academic textbooks I read, they suck. I look into them because I'm trying to find some piece of information. Whereas things usually written by 1 or 2 authors often are great. Like, T. Colin Campbell's China Study. It's one experienced, knowledgeable author, puts it all together. And so I say that because the guys who write these sort of books, they're just trying to get, some type of publication, or because they were told to do it. They're not writing out of an interest in explaining something. They don't have a purpose, is what I'm saying. They're just doing it as a formality little thing on their job, and they write these wimpy chapters full of statistics, one of the best books I ever read for becoming a great author was The Art of Literature by Arthur Schopenhauer. That's a magnificent book. Okay, if you really care about trying to be great at writing, not just a typical modern BS artist or liar or promoter or something. I'm not talking about that. I'm trying, if you want to write something that is great and beautiful and meaningful and has lasting value, that's the book to help guide you. The Art of Literature by Schopenhauer. Okay, so we continue with Chesterton. One word that tells us what we do not know outweighs 1,000 words that tell us what we already do know. Yeah, a good author gets to the point about something useful. Typical crappy writers and phonies, they always just keep going on and on about stuff you already know. Okay, Chesterton continues. The supreme stamp of the barbarian is the sacrifice of the permanent to the temporary. Okay, it is not we who censor the press. It is the press who silences us. Chesterton continues. It is impossible to satirize a man without having a full account of his virtues. We might be angry at a libel, but not at satire. For a man is angry at a libel because it is false, but at satire because it is true. The man who talks too much because he is interested in the subject. He is not interested in himself. If he were interested in himself, he would behave better. The man who really thinks he has an idea will always try to explain that idea. But the charlatan who has no idea will always confine himself to explaining that it's too complicated, too subtle to be explained. Chesterton continues, I have searched all the parks in all the cities and found no statues of committees. Okay, then there's a poem from Lepanto. This is one of his famous poems. Okay, now we're just going to finish up here with a little bit about Hilaire Belloc. And in his lifetime, he was real famous, and he was a bit more of a historian and an economist, and he was also a real religious guy. I'll just share with you a few of his quotes, basically introducing you to him as well as Chesterton a moment ago. Hilaire Belloc. It has been discovered, by the way, he lived from 1870 to 1953. Here's his first quote. It has been discovered that with a dull urban population, all formed under a mechanical system of education, any suggestion or command, however senseless and unreasoned, will be obeyed if sufficiently repeated. Yeah, I've seen that. That's amazing how the average stupid person, they don't even think. They just, whatever they've heard, that's what's true. I remember I was talking to this one lady. She's a technologist, like with a 2-year junior college education. And she said to me, she goes, well, that was in the newspaper, so it has to be true. I said, that was in the newspaper, therefore it has to be untrue. Belloc continues, the control of the production of wealth is the control of human life itself. The term socialism is a common label for removal of private property and community control at the expense of family and individual freedom. It was the faith that had gradually and indirectly transformed the slave into the serf and the serf into a free peasant. This thing must be done as a whole, and it can be done as a whole only by the ambient influence of Catholicism. That's the other thing people don't read. Despite all the problems with Christianity, it pushes people out of slavery and serfdom. It really does. And without it, there's no argument against slavery or serfdom. Don't get me wrong. It's not perfect, and it's been abused plenty of times. But it's on the side of the little guy. That's why the rulers all want to get rid of Christianity. They don't like the way it makes the little guy. Christianity basically says each individual guy, no matter how poor and ignorant, is equal before the eyes of God as the king, okay? You think the king likes that? No, he says make that religion illegal, okay? It empowers the poor individual, and that's a good thing. It makes society better. It makes everybody have a better chance at living a decent life. Belloc continues, all industrial civilization is clearly moving towards the reestablishment of a servile condition. Yeah, I mean, basically, who is it that can't speak their mind? A slave. Who is it that can't defend themselves? A slave. Who is it that must beg for food? A slave, okay? And society's kind of sadly going in that direction. And it's sort of like people need to be able to educate themselves, to be self-sufficient. And if too much of society doesn't sort of see that, there's different paths to serfdom. And one can be hedonism. Hedonism makes people weak into chumps and losers. There's other paths. That especially comes from, like the book Brave New World. All right. The Catholic Church is a perpetually defeated thing that always outlives her conquerors. Hilaire Belloc. If you can describe clearly without a diagram the proper way of making this or that thing, then you are a master of the English language. Ownership is not a general feature of our society determining its character. On the contrary, dependence on a precarious wage at the will of others is the general feature of our society. Hilaire Belloc. And that's real true. If you read about times of starvation, for example, during the Renaissance and before and after around then, people lived out in the country, could grow their own food. They had food. Okay, the people live in the cities working on a wage. They lose their job. They're in trouble. They can't pay their rent. They can't buy food. They could starve to death pretty easily. And ownership's not really as common in our society as people think it is. I mean, why do we pay property taxes? Why should we pay a property tax? You really own your house or your land or whatever if you have to pay property tax on it? You don't even own the land. Belloc continues as the last quote from Belloc, last quote in the slide. This talk. If we do not restore the institution of property, we cannot escape restoring the institution of slavery. There is no third course. He that has not property is under economic servitude to him who has property. Okay, so that's it for G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc.